Good evening, everyone. My name is Christy Barlow. I'm the Assistant Director of Education, Engagement, and Learning here at the Jule, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight for an artist talk by Cara Despain, followed by a conversation between Cara and our guest curator, Elizabeth Hawley. So just to do a quick intro, Cara is a multidisciplinary artist working in film, video, sound, sculpture, and installation to explore land use, climate change, and the impacts of frontierism on ecological and social systems. Her recent solo exhibitions include Spectre, New Mexico at New Mexico State University Art Museum, Spectre at the Bass Museum of Art, and In Memoriam Carbon Paintings at Kimball Art Center. Her work is held in major collections and featured in publications such as The Guardian and Sculpture Magazine. And her 3D object, And the Desert Shall Bloom as the Rose, is on view here at the Jule through July 11th as part of our Being and Belonging exhibition organized by our guest curator, Elizabeth Hawley. So Elizabeth Betsy Hawley is an art historian, writer, and curator, specializing in the art of the Americas and modern and contemporary art. Her research often focuses on 20th and 21st century Indigenous art, while also specializing in feminist and women's art, activist art, eco-critical art, and the art of the American West. Hawley's work has been supported by the Lunder Institute, the Wolfsonian at FIU, and Pittsburgh Foundation. She's an assistant professor of art history at the University of South Alabama in Mobile. And following Betsy and Cara's conversation, we'll have time for a few questions from the audience. But before I pass everything over to Cara, just a few quick thank yous. So first, we want to extend our deepest appreciation to all of our museum partners and the entire museum staff for the important work surrounding the exhibition, and to our museum donors for their investments to present these and other programs, and also to our unit leadership, including President Christopher B. Roberts. Speaking of donors, a quick reminder, Tiger Giving Day is March 25th, and it's almost here. So during this 24-hour university campaign, we are raising funds to conserve the Dale Chihuly piece, Amber Lester, this striking sculpture that welcomes you as you arrive to the museum. So visit tigergiving.org to preview our project this week and make your gift on March 25th. Any amount makes a difference. We appreciate your support of Auburn University and the Jule. And I encourage you to also visit the Jule's website, jcsm.auburn.edu, to learn more about our future programming. Now, please join me in welcoming to Auburn, Cara Despain.
Hello. All right. I'm going to give you World in a Minute, just a quick background of my work specifically on nuclearism and the legacy of nuclearism in the Colorado Plateau, where I'm from. So real quick, the overarching kind of theme of my work is taking on the dark side of the American West. We're really used to beautiful images and paintings and a sort of celebratory narrative of what the West is and represents. And I do think that there's a global corollary to that. So I think that the through line actually continues pretty well with the sort of military industrial complex that was developed there. But just to give you a bit of that background, I reference Western cinema a lot, not because most of it is very good, but because of what it invokes for people when they think of what the West is, and the kind of cinematic quality to a lot of those landscapes, where in some of those very same places, there's a very hidden and obscure dark history beneath the pretty view. Do you guys know this movie? Okay, good. I heard one yes, I'll take it. Last time nobody knew that, and I was horrified. So I have a personal relationship to this history. My mom and my grandmother, who's here in this picture, my grandmother and me, grew up in southwestern Utah in a very rural town that was about 130 miles away from the Nevada test site, where from 1951 to the 90s, they did testing Over 1,000 tests were detonated at that site. And prior to 1962, there was 100 atmospheric tests. So they were, 130 miles away from that site. And I think that nuclearism and the legacy of that affects every single living organism on Earth. But I just like to kind of lay out that I do have a personal connection to it. So, and the Trinity downwinders were never made whole, never apologized to, never acknowledged. And I think maybe Betsy and I will talk about that a little later, where the site of the first atomic test. And the way that that sunk into pop culture is something that I've been fascinated in this work. So as the Cold War progressed, and that's when they were doing tests at the Nevada site, there was this sort of quasi-science fiction narrative surrounding what nuclearism and what testing was, what the atomic bomb was, why we were testing stuff, and how it was going to protect us from the Soviets. But then it started to generate all this interesting science fiction and culture surrounding that. And I think that it's interesting that that kind of bubbled to the surface where the actual, what was happening on the ground didn't so much. I've had exhibitions, done talks in the Mountain West region, and a lot of people still don't know that we did any testing at all in the Nevada desert, even though that's the very middle of the Western US. This is a picture from the site. So the selection of the site itself was a deep injustice on many levels. First and foremost, it was Western Shoshone land, and they never consented to it being used for that purpose. But there was also a very direct appeal to Mormon settlers in that area, including my family, who were doing subsistence farming, raising sheep, and they were thought to be compliant, obedient, patriotic Mormons, which was true, but also they were treated as expendable. And there's documented mention of this in congressional hearings. They called them, there's a word that some of the downwinders that I spoke to, virtual uninhabitants. So this goes to the idea of waste landing, which I think Betsy and I will also probably talk about, but just this idea that nobody was out there. And that was something that was used in the genocide that came prior to white settlement in the West, but also there is another form of kind of nuclear colonialism that has persisted in that region, and this is a great example. This is what it looks like from space, where you can see some of the subsidence craters. I want to back up also and say that when they started this testing, this was a warning that was posted maybe in a couple of places, but the people of that area that were downwind were never properly warned. And when the winds were blowing toward Los Angeles or toward Las Vegas, which Las Vegas is only 65 miles away, they wouldn't test, but if it was blowing east over Utah, they would test. And of course, there was a culture around that where there was atomic cocktail parties and people in Vegas would watch the bombs be detonated. Part of that was that they really didn't know the harms. Part of it was just the spectacle of militarism, which is sort of fascinating in its own way. But it's interesting, the cultural memory and the psychic imprint that exists from our legacy with nuclearism, but that doesn't manage to persist in truth. It persists in spectacle. And I think a lot about that when I'm making the work that I make. There was also folks that went to, it was like a special opportunity to go and watch the tests. I think my great aunt went because she was dating someone in the military. People were filming the tests to get data, but also just to document them. And many of them got sick from cancers years later. So this is just some of the wackier examples of culture. Miss Atomic Energy from Vegas, this cake that's shaped like a mushroom cloud. I mean, it's pretty psychotic when you really have some distance from it. These are doom towns. Where they would set up mannequins from JCPenney to, as if that could measure the insidious decades-long horrors that came from fallout and radiation. But they would construct these towns to test the durability of materials and They would put these mannequins there to, I don't know what, make it scarier. But there were real people living in this downwind region. These are some pictures of my family and the types of activities they would do on the farm and in the surrounding area of southern Utah, which is very beautiful, contains several national parks. And I bring this up because subsistence farming in the 50s meant that you were eating local livestock that you raised, some of which would go and feed into parts of Nevada. You were drinking local milk, and those were touching points for radiation delivery and fallout byproduct delivery into the bodies of people in that region and beyond. This is a map of that the atomic energy that was based on their data that was put together to show all the places across the United States that it reached. So even though I'm kind of hyper-regional in what I'm talking about, we are, as my friend Mary Dixon, who's this activist here, who is a complete badass and brilliant woman, we're all downwinders because, as you can see, there's pockets of fallout that reached almost everywhere in the country. Duck and cover might be something that some of you remember. That was, it's in the Library of Congress now, but they would play it on TV to tell people to duck and cover to protect themselves from what they said was Soviet bombing, but the funny thing is that they should be covering themselves from their own country bombing them. And Nevada is the most nuked place on Earth. I'm not gonna, or, this was a PSA that went out. I won't play that right now. So some of the sheep farmers in this region were the first to kind of sound the alarm, and they were kind of gaslit for many years. People didn't believe them for a long time, even though they were seeing their sheep being born dead, coming back from grazing with beta burns, very palpable outcomes of radiation poisoning. And eventually, years later, it was the Bullock family that was the first to testify before Congress and get RECA passed. This is a Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. It's problematic in and of itself. I won't go into that right now, but these livestock were then grazing on grass that was covered in fallout, and the fallout was getting into the milk. And it just took years for anybody to believe these, quote, stupid farmers, which is another thing that is documented in a congressional hearing. Which that was one of them. So meanwhile, there was uranium mining happening in that same region to create the bombs that were then being tested on the same region. And the downwinders that suffered as a result of uranium mining, which were primarily the Dene Navajo people in the Four Corners region, were also not recognized if ever, for a very long time in the Radiation Compensation Act. But it's an even more obscured and unjust side of this history. And there was also a federally sponsored uranium boom that happened in the same region that came along with all of its own weirdo pop culture and prospecting. And some of this persists. If you go to Moab, Utah, there's still the uranium building. You can still get like a uranium burger at some places. And again, it's just kind of fascinating to me that this is what floats to the top. So back to Western cinema for a second. Monument Valley was one of the places where there was a lot of uranium mining. And John Wayne, our hero of the Western movie genre, was shooting a film down there. He also shot another film called The Conqueror, where he played Genghis Khan, which was a crazy choice. And Howard Hughes bought all the copies of the movie and hid it away because it was fairly terrible. But they shot that in Snow Canyon, Utah, which was maybe 20 miles or so from where my mom grew up. And about half of the cast and crew from that film, it was after the Dirty Harry test, which was the dirtiest one that they did at the Nevada site. And about half of the cast and crew got different cancers, and another third of them died. Hard to prove causation or correlation, but statistically that doesn't make sense. But it was something that was there. They are on the set with a Geiger counter. The fame of him might have risen that the efforts of the Bullock family, sadly, but I hope that their efforts were their own. So the way that it filters into my work is the personal connection is part of it. I'm going to show you some other work I've done before I talk about what's here at the museum. But this is a flashing neon sign. I wish I had a video of it, but that's kind of meant to like play off of that psycho culture of prospecting and getting your own Geiger counter and trying your luck at finding this horribly dangerous radioactive material. And I wanted to, doing what I normally do, which is use the beautiful cinematic landscapes of the West to kind of do a bait and switch and unearth or undermine that and reveal the darker history. I wanted to really zero in on the legacy of the effects of nuclearism in the Southwest and the West. And I did that through a couple of different routes. One, the beautiful. Two, I felt like I needed to, I don't want to say qualify it, but I wanted to bring the real like testimonies, the real experiences of people that I know in the various downwind communities that I've worked with to it as well. So this is a piece called On the Record. Hot Milk is side 1 and Yellow Cake is side 2. And I collected or borrowed oral histories from different sources. On one side, it was Utah downwinders, and on the other, it was uranium miners.
We saw the flash of light. It was quite bright, and I've never seen anything like that. We were sitting inside the house, but I can tell you, it shook that old house so bad that it was really scary. During this time, they warned us that they would be telling us to get under our desks for safety's sake, which is pretty stupid, isn't it?
That's a video that I erased John Wayne out of the final iconic scene of The Searchers. So Monument Valley, a lot of people are still dealing with contaminated water, and unremediated uranium mines are all over the Navajo Nation and that whole area. So I was just kind of thinking about breaking the fourth wall and kind of what's in the background, as opposed to the narrative that we've spun with a hero cowboy as our front man. I'm gonna move through the kind of Cold War space race stuff and how that intersects with nuclearism pretty quick. But of course, the development of missiles and rockets looked like it was to go to the moon, but it was largely to carry nuclear warheads. And that's another part of culture that got sort of twisted. So these are moonscapes and test sites and uranium mine sites from all over the world that I used a CNC router and Google Earth maps and a bunch of different software that was born of the Cold War, such as satellite, to make these topographies of these different locations, Soviet tests and US tests, and the Oppenheimer crater. That's the South Pacific. This is a Nevada test site, so that there's the craters that I was mentioning. I think that's the Black Hills mine. So this was the show at the Bass Museum, Spectre, and you can see the cabinet. That was its first showing. And this, I had an opportunity to have a museum solo show. I had already made this video using declassified footage from the Nevada test sites. And I created a video installation, 3-channel with really bassy music. It's actually a Mormon hymn called Love One Another. And I had an opportunity to use uranium glass, which is a antique Depression era dishware that uses uranium oxide as a colorant. So there was a lot of glass from this time, like the 30s and 40s. You may have seen it in like your grandparents' house or a thrift store, and it's usually kind of light pastel colors. They used various things to color this glass. This one particular one, because it was uranium oxide, it was technically radioactive, but it also fluoresced. It also fluoresces in UV light. And when I first started seeing these dishes, I just found them like haunting and spooky, but they also spoke to just like everyday people in domestic life. That were just sort of the unwitting absorption of radiation, and all of those things kind of folded together. So I had this opportunity with some funding to create this big installation using it, and I decided to create an entry with architecture that was kind of Art Deco inspired to lead into the video. And the infinity cabinet was a part of that. So there you can kind of see looking through the doorway into the video. And in 1942, guess why? Every speck of domestic uranium, you couldn't use it anymore to color glass because they wanted it to build bombs. So there's a very distinct time stamp on this glass that really, prior to that, there wasn't much use for uranium. But it just sort of hints at this history that was to follow. And maybe that's partly why they feel so fraught and haunted to me. But this was a way to kind of tie together this ready-made, haunted, fraught, but very ordinary object in with this idea of landscape and beauty and, delicate spectral prettiness, and then really come from behind with the punch of the reality, I guess. This is a picture of the installation. And here's just an example of what some of the glassware is. And even as cool as this stuff is, it's not like most of it, especially what I have in my collection, is not precious. It was mold made, mass produced. They would give it away in cereal boxes, and you could find it pretty easily. And I just kind of chose pieces that looked a bit deco-y for this particular installation. All of that said, it is really cool stuff. It is really beautiful. And I have learned a lot about it from all the glass nerds that I've intersected with in the process. And that's what it looks like when it's not under UV light. It can range just if anyone's curious, it can range anywhere from like an acid green or a darker green to what they call milk glass or Vaseline glass, which is like kind of opaque, pale yellow. Canary glass, sometimes it's called too. I'm not a scientist or an expert on antiques. I'm just going to say that right now, so that if anyone was going to ask me deeper questions on those things, that's my disclaimer right here at the top. I stuck this in here just because that's what inspired the doorway for that installation. The Wizard of Oz has so many corollaries for me about like that. It was made in 1939, so that particular moment right before the Manhattan Project and World War II. There's a lot to it for me. But with my installations, I think a lot about cinema and set design. And I feel like sometimes I'm going more towards building sets than making art shows, which I'm fine with. This is a 4 foot by 4 foot cast that I did in the same manner as those others of the Nevada test site. And I kind of think of it as a tombstone or a monument for something that nobody can go to still because it's too irradiated, but also it's still hidden in secret, even though it's this giant swath of land out in the desert. But it's just kind of laying those scars bare. That's me this is how crazy I get in my planning. So this was Spectre, New Mexico, an expanded version of the show that was in Miami with some of these same pieces. And I did a few drawing and painting stills from the video that were like Rorschachs of the test clouds. And I was thinking of those as very haunted landscapes. Everything is a landscape painting to me, pretty much. But I also thought of like the backdrops of religious paintings from the Renaissance and stuff, and I just found that so haunting. And I did an interesting interview with a journalist that follows nuclear issues in New Mexico really closely, and she was working on like a longer piece about people using religious language to describe the atomic bomb. And it's really interesting because I've intersected that with that too. And there is this like sci-fi quasi-spiritual feeling that it invokes for a lot of people. And I don't know, that's something that maybe we can unpack later, but that's there for me in those paintings and drawings. That's a big one that was in that show. And I did some drawings, which I did to kind of mimic the film stills from the video. Thinking of the end title cards. I didn't say this about that other piece, but those are all atomic energy PSAs and different films about atomic energy or nuclear weapons. And I took the ending title cards from a bunch of them. It's like 7 minutes of just saying the end, the end, the end over and over again. This is another version of Test of Faith. So the architecture is different every time I build that installation out. And some of these are also infinity cabinets. This is just walking through it so you get a sense. I won't make you watch the whole thing. Or I won't make you watch any of it. This is another version of the installation that was at the Orlando Museum of Art. And again, I used a lot of the architecture of the building. Also, I think a little bit of like Stanley Kubrick sets when I'm doing this stuff. I'm a little bit neurotic about symmetry. So I had to seek out, when I started collecting the glass, I had to seek out like specific sets to satisfy that. But it was kind of a fun treasure hunt, to be honest. And this is, I won't play the whole thing right now. You can see it on my website if you're interested, but this is just to give you a sense of the video. And then I'm gonna talk with Betsy so I don't have to talk by myself anymore. I find that the scale can be hard to understand in still photos, so.
As I have loved you, love one another. This new commandment, love one another. By this child, we are His
We're good.
All right, I think we are. Thank you again so much for being with us here today and giving us this presentation. I have a few discussion questions to get us started, and I think we'll reserve some time at the end for a Q&A. I'm sure that all of you have questions as well. And I think since the show Being and Belonging in American Art, it's which your piece, and the desert shall blossom as the rose is in. The show is really all about how we define American art, right? How we have defined it historically, how we could or should define it today, how we might define it in the future. So I want to sort of ask you about your practice in those terms. And something I'm thinking about in particular is the way that certain mainstream conceptions of American art, this category of American art, they've always seemed a little bit troubled by a kind of provincialism or regionalism. And I think even back to very early American art, right, colonial, federal period American art, you have these artists who are really striving to prove that they are just as good as their European counterparts. And then you move into the 20th century and you have the American modernists who are trying to produce work that is distinctly American. They are trying to produce American work, but also really trying to prove that it is just as radical, right, and just as sort of cutting edge and avant-garde as European art. And it all starts to center on these hubs of art production, right? Sort of Boston, Philadelphia early on, New York then takes the fore. LA is a big area for this now. But I think this really leaves out a lot of really interesting critical work that is being produced in in other places and by people who are sometimes themselves kind of othered, capital O. And something I've really enjoyed in producing the Being and Belonging show here at the Jule is I've gotten to go through the permanent collection, and the Jule has an incredible holding of contemporary Southern art, art being produced in the American South. And I think a lot of these artists are not as well known as perhaps they should be. And I think that is in part because of where this art is being produced. And
And you were in this very interesting position where you split your time between Salt Lake City and Miami, which are two very different American cities. And I know, Utah has a thriving arts community, and you are very much a part of that. But I think sometimes that work maybe doesn't get picked up nationally in the way that art being produced in these sort of hubs tends to be more picked up. And then, of course, there's Miami, which has become part of this national and really international art scene, right? And it is a bit of a scene, right? I think of Art Basel, it's a scene. So I'm wondering if you can talk about producing this kind of work and spending time in both of these places and how that's impacted your practice as an American artist, and maybe also how you've seen that impact the reception of your work, which you have shown in Utah and in South Florida pretty extensively.
Yeah. I love Utah. I don't want to disparage the scene there, but there is a pretty distinct lack of resources for artists. I think that that's like a general problem of the Mountain West. Grants are difficult to come by. Production budgets tend to be smaller. As a historically very conservative place, I struggled before I moved to Miami. I struggled against that a bit because even if people aren't like conservative anymore, or maybe they never were, but their board members are, whatever it is, there's a bit of lack of faith or imagination for what can be done or produced. And before I moved to Miami, I was on the other side of it sometimes too, because I wanted like a high tide to raise all boats type of a thing. Like, well, if there's not good venues for showing art here, then let's make one, or let's run an art center in this abandoned schoolhouse and see what happens. And that was super fun, but I kind of got to the end of that and I wanted to like push my own work further. And it really was Miami where I was able to grow as an artist. A big part of that had to do with resources. I don't know if people that have grown up in Miami would tell you the same thing, but to me, coming from a place where there isn't good resources, Miami looks great. It looks like everybody mostly is getting a slice of pie. There's grants all over the place. There's art collectors that buy art. There's museums that fund things. There's artist-run spaces that give grant money. Like, to me, it looks pretty great, and it has been really great for me. And then another interesting thing happened where there's such a magic, like, tenderness and love for any regional, like, art scene where you have, and I think it's true for lots of different pockets, especially the ones that tend to be out of the centers. So like, so many of my friends that are artists in Utah make work about the West or about different things that are a bit regional because there's such a love of that. I mean, I think Icelandic artists do the same thing. I think New Mexico artists do the same thing. A lot of South Florida artists do the same thing, whether it's ecology or culture or whatever. And I very much make work about the West, and it's very dear to me, but it wasn't until I moved to the South, to the most polar opposite city I could have possibly picked, that I actually had like the critical distance I needed to make work about the West in a more like, and have my practice and output grow. And again, part of that was resources, but I think part of it was the critical distance from the subject matter, because I'm like the only person in Miami. I'm like one of two people from Utah, and so like I can spin this stuff in such a different way, like the romantic landscape part like really functions in a totally different way in that region. Also, when I had this show at the Bass, I was like, I don't know if people that are on a vacation in Miami Beach that are coming to this museum are gonna like clock, are they gonna just see this really pretty glass and be like, wow, what a cool, but people got it. And I think it in a way, it helped to contextualize me outside of my born context or something. I don't know completely, but I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it definitely did. I'm wondering too about the sort of reception of your work. Do you find that it gets, depending on where you are presenting these pieces, do they get sort of picked up by national arts or international arts outlets more in one place or the other, or do you not find that to be the case?
Just visibility is better in Miami. Not by no fault of the region. It's just the Mountain West is tough. There's like scant art coverage.
Sure.
The shout out to Southwest Contemporary, because that's like a newer magazine that's doing a very thorough job. But prior to that, it's hard. When I had my show at the Bass, I got like a write-up in The Guardian that blew my mind. And another, I guess this was from a slightly different route, maybe through the New Mexico show, but I was in an article that my friend Sean wrote for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which blew my mind. Art newspaper, like that came out of Miami. So like the exposure, because probably it's more of an art city, is better in that way.
Well, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, yes, it's a very interdisciplinary work that's been written up in some interdisciplinary sources. And I paired your work with Irene Rice Pereira's composition here, because of course you are both referencing these nuclear histories via the materials of your work. And I do want to get into that further, but before we get into that aspect of your work, and while we're kind of on the topic of American art, and how we think about American art, define American art, maybe this fantasy of American art and America, I do want to point out that in the exhibition, and I hope most of you have seen the exhibition. If you haven't, please go into the galleries and take a look. Cara's work and Irene Rice Pereira's work, it is actually directly across from a Georgia O'Keeffe landscape, a very sort of classically Georgia O'Keeffe, right? Sort of the rolling hills of the high desert under a blue sky with clouds. Really wonderful Georgia O'Keeffe painting. And you started to get into this in your talk. Something you really grappled with in so many of your projects is this sort of romanticized idea of the American West that is informed by landscape paintings, including the ones you showed, including our sort of images we think of with O'Keeffe. This idea of a kind of empty West, and that O'Keeffe landscape, it is empty. It is just the empty, barren, rolling hills. The empty West, the Hollywood West. I sort of think of it as the modernist artists West, which is to say sort of non-native, white artists. It's the New Yorkers in New Mexico, right? That idea of the American West, and which was really widely circulated. Can you talk about a little bit more about how you are addressing this in your work and sort of deconstructing those fantasies of the West in your work?
Yeah. Virtual uninhabitants. The emptiness of the West has long been part of the mythology for the art world and non-art world alike. And if there is emptiness or the perception of emptiness, that was won by extraction, violence, and genocide, as we kind of know by now. But I think sometimes what gets overlooked, even when people think they're working through that, is that first of all, there have been people in that region prior to European settlers, of course. And then there also have been many other people and cultures that they brought with besides that. And it's not just a playground of pretty landscapes, it's that too. But there's these histories that are buried there that actually are hiding in plain sight if you know how to read a landscape. So, things like the topography of the Nevada test site that, in a very practical way, I just took Google Earth. Don't sue me. You can't, can you? It's our Earth, it's Earth. That's what I tend to think about that. But I just used that
satellite imagery to create that piece in just objectively showing those scars. I didn't manipulate it. I didn't put them there. I'm just sort of revealing what that is. And to me, that's a stand-in, like City might be a good example, the Michael Heiser piece in Nevada, because it finally opened after 1,000 years of doing. But like something like that, and I'm not trying to, hate on it here, but think what you want, but something like that, in my mind, does nothing to further the narrative about the deserts of the West, about Nevada in particular, about Western Shoshone land in particular, or any of the other myths that come along with the Western desert. That to me doesn't do much. It just kind of superimposes a kind of sci-fi interesting design landscape, but it makes a monument to one artist is more what that does. And I think that's always been the tension of like anybody coming to the West and making work about it instead of coming from within it, maybe. So that's sort of the bent that I'm on. Maybe a big, I have a video that's like a 4-channel video of pretty landscapes from my parents' 35 millimeter slide archive. And then I made a forced perspective and burned dynamite fuse across the frame. Forgive me if this is hard to imagine, but so what happens is you're in a big room with 4 walls of projected landscapes, and then a fuse is just burning around you. And it's making the kind of like Looney Tunes. And it feels familiar. It feels like a Western movie. Maybe you think of Warner Brothers, but you also feel that tension of like, well, what's going to explode and why? And is it opening a mine or, creating the Zion Tunnel, which was done with hand dynamite, fun fact. But I'm always trying to like get that familiar fuzzy feeling that you might get from some of the pretty landscape stuff and then overturn that, kind of like lifting up a rock when you see all the worms and ants and insects and scorpions.
Sort of disruption. That's really interesting. Yeah. And thinking about the artist's role there, I am keeping an eye on the time, and I want to make sure we have time for others' questions. So I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'll see if folks in the audience have some things they want to talk about. I think just thinking about the role of the artist and that kind of disruption, it can be easy, or seemingly easy, I think, to kind of assign responsibilities for nuclear weapons and warfare when it comes to military leaders and politicians, policymakers, activists, lobbyists, and so on. But I think the role of the artist is not always as clear. And I'm wondering, when it comes to these histories and these politics and current events, of course, what do you where do you feel that your responsibility lies as an artist? And maybe not just in terms of your work, but just generally, where do responsibilities fall when it comes to artists, broad category? And then what are your goals in terms of what you might accomplish with this kind of work?
That's always a tricky one, because with the nuclear stuff, I do my best to participate in some level of activism or awareness sharing, or issues that intersect with like visual media and anti-nuclear messaging. But I also make a lot of work about the Anthropocene and climate collapse. And I don't want to be assumed to be like some amazing activist just because I make art about that stuff. It's not that it means I don't care. I just don't want to get too much credit for those things. So I like to differentiate that, if that makes sense. I do feel with this particular body of work, I think my friend Josh Wheeler, who was on the panel with me in New Mexico when I had the show there, they did a panel with a bunch of anti-nuclear type people because the Oppenheimer film was about to come out. So this was a couple years ago. And he kind of said it best, I think because we were all about the same age, and there was a lot of older folks in that audience, which was awesome because they were like committed to the topic and Some of them were like Tularosa Basin downwinders, which was the Trinity test, first test ever. And so somebody was like, well, why do all you younger folks persist in this topic, something like that? And he was like, I'm just haunted by it. Like, I think we're all haunted by it. And I was like, yes, I feel specifically haunted by it. And I don't know, some of that is personal because of my family intersections with it, but also it feels bigger than me. And I do feel like as a person, and this was true for all of us on that panel, like it had touched our lives either in family history or in the present. You know, there was people there that had family that still worked at the Los Alamos lab. My uncle worked at the Los Alamos lab, you know, kind of later than the Manhattan Project, but was still doing particle physics and classified work that we don't even know. And so it's still very present. And I think I see these downwinders, you know, that are in their late 70s, 80s, if they haven't died from a consequence of fallout, they're still dying as old age approaches. And I feel sort of terrified that with the in-between generation, there's a lot of things in contemporary society that are getting lost generationally. But this one feels in a distinct danger, even as we're on the precipice of nuclear war still. So I do feel in this case of this work, like a particular drive to keep sending that message into the future. I mean, we've talked about reinstating testing at the Nevada test site recently. That is horrifying.
And uranium mining.
And uranium mining recently. And nuclear energy is not as clean as it's billed as. There's always somebody that suffers a consequence, and it's usually the people of New Mexico. So I think for all of those reasons, yeah, I feel a particular fire under my butt to persist in that. And art is my platform. So I guess that's like, speaking about the role of the artist, like, I don't know, I always was on track to be an artist. Like, I wasn't ever really gonna do anything else. And so if this is where I need to put the message, this is where my expertise is. You know, I didn't become a scientist, but this is where I can convey that haunt.
All right, well, I think we have a roving microphone here. If anyone has questions, I have a million more questions for you, but
Yes.
I don't want to be selfish here. Yep.
Thank you. So I really enjoyed the video that you played with the mirroring. And what I saw in it is it was kind of like turning like the clouds into something that looked a lot more organic because of the bilateral symmetry that you created. And I was wondering if that was something that you were thinking about when you were making it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So in some circles, the imagery that has been appropriated of atomic tests, like the iconic mushroom cloud, like reads as harmful. And I understand why, because there were people suffering real consequences of that. It wasn't just something on the cover of a comic book. And so when I was gonna make that video, I knew I didn't want to use that uninterrupted image. It's also one of those images that is so overused, I think we stop seeing it. And I wanted to, I sound like a snake oil salesman, but because I keep saying I want to trick people, but I wanted to use that as a bit of a trick to create a kind of hypnotizing thing. Also, of course, like Rorschach tests are a part of that. And there is this like psychological simultaneous thing that's happening when you're watching that. And that was another thing where I was like, is it too pretty? Are people gonna clock it? And in these installations, people like sit down on the ground and like leave crying. So that's not my goal per se, but it is affecting. And I think that people, I was worried, but I don't think people are missing the point. I think it's still delivered.
Thank you so much for coming. I think that a lot of us are sitting here right now very affected by what you've presented. So thank you. It's
Thank
very
you.
moving.
Thank you.
And I'm from Fort Lauderdale, and I agree that Salt Lake is not where Miami is in the art and cultural world, but it's
Yeah.
still an awesome Utah. I go every summer.
Yeah. Great.
Outside of Park City. Amazing beauty, but also there's something about the stillness and the wide open places and the lack of trees in some of these places. But I just wanted to say, like, I really don't have a question just because I'm so moved by what you presented. And I did see your work already, and it didn't impact me the same way as tonight has. So now I'm going to have to go back a second time. But anyway, thank you so much for
thank
everything
you.
you're doing.
Thank you. I should say, on the symmetry note, the glass pieces, because some of those forms are kind of weird. That's why I showed you that first minute or so. I was kind of struck by how strange and otherworldly they looked. And I was thinking of those shapes, because once they become symmetrical, then you start thinking of them as objects, and our brains are built and wired to do that. But I was thinking of that when I selected the glass. I was kind of imagining it as a, blooming prickly pear, or one of the images from the video, which you might not get looking at it without me saying that. But
It is such loaded work, though, and I think it unfolds in a way. I think, and it is work that is so beautiful. It's so visually seductive. It sort of draws you in just because of it's luminous and it's glowing and it's sort of lovely in that way. And then the more you learn about the history behind it and the materials being used to produce it, it becomes more sort of impactful. I think, and it is very haunting. These works are sort of haunted.
yeah.
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 Yeah. Let me ask you one quick question.
Yeah.
Because it gets at something you hinted at in your presentation, the title. And the desert shall blossom as the rose. This is, of course, it's part of this larger Test of Faith series, but the piece is in "And the desert shall blossom as the rose." Can you tell us about that? Because I know you mentioned the spiritual language being used around a lot of this, and you are sort of drawing from that here.
Yeah. That is a passage from the Bible that the Mormons appropriated when they were settling in Utah, in the Salt Lake Valley. And it was sort of this idea that, like, the divine would gift them everything they needed out in the desert, and it would bloom as the rose for them, and they would prosper and have everything they needed. It was also, and this gets into some weird Mormon dogma, so I won't go too far, but it was also used to describe when they started putting indigenous people into homes with Mormon families to try to, and later some of the Indian schools, they also said that they would blossom as the rose, because it's a whole thing, because Mormons thought that the native people were Lamanites that needed to be helped. So it was all, I just want to acknowledge that, because it was also applied in that way, and that's an even worse meaning. So I like to not leave that out.
Yeah. And visually, the blossoming of sort of mushroom cloud, I think of that as well, which is sort of replicated in some of the...
But it's generally understood as that kind of appropriated passage about settling in the desert.
Great. Thank you for explaining that.
Yeah.
I think there is never enough time to talk about Cara's work. It's 5 o'clock and I'm getting a look from Christy.
Well, yeah, so thank you all for coming this evening, and I definitely encourage you to go check out Cara's work and check out the exhibition, and come back and see us again on April 2nd for the Dana Ty Soon Burgess Dance Company. He'll be performing a dance piece inspired by Helen Frankenthaler's work. And so now if we could just, say thank you to Cara and Betsy.
All right, thank all of you.
Thank you so much for coming.